Let her run. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be continuing our conversation about value theory. We're going to take a look at the chapters in the fundamentals of ethics concerning what is called the desire satisfaction theory of happiness. Hopefully you've read those chapters already and will have some good sense of what I will be talking about. Now, at the onset of the first, and both of these chapters are short, that's among their virtues. But at the onset of this first chapter on the desire satisfaction theory of happiness, the author poses a scenario of a novice human being, a person who hasn't been around the block, who wants to figure out how to go about living a good life. Now, unsurprisingly, a novice might want to talk to whom? You might want to talk to an expert. Yeah, someone who's been around the block. So he talks to various people who think they know what kind of ways of life are conducive to living a good life. One says become a chess master. One of them says to pursue a particular line of work. Another says to do Y. Another says to do Z. Now, this person looks at all of these things that these people give him advice on, and he says, I don't want to do any of those things. Those things don't interest me. Those things would not, AKA, make me happy. Now, the point that the author's trying to make here is that what we call the desire satisfaction theory of happiness suggests that what living a good life is, or what will benefit you when it comes to living a good life, is best viewed as what? The word starts with an S. Thank you. I heard it. A bunch of you saying it. Yeah. It will argue that what constitutes a good life is wholly subjective. Now, the sort of underlying rationale behind thinking this is reasonable, and I have this on the board, is what the author of the text calls the personal authority argument, or the personal authority rationale. Who knows you better than you know you? And if you know you better than anyone else knows you, aren't you arguably in the best position to figure out what a good life would be for you? That's the argument. Plenty of people might give you advice about how to go about living a good life, but though their ways of living a good life just so happen may not end up working for you. Now, this is part of why, from the get-go, the desire satisfaction theory of happiness contends that what constitutes a good life is in the eye of the beholder, and it argues for no what? It argues that there are no objective goods. Now, I want to say something critical here. There's something in the textbook that you may have read that understandably may have hung you up a little bit. When the author speaks of something being good for you, he spoke as if those kinds of things were... He spoke of things that you desire being intrinsically good for you. And by the way, folks, if you found that to be a little bit confusing, I understand that perfectly. Because from what we've spoken about in terms of intrinsic goods so far, intrinsic goods seem to be things that are good for human beings, regardless of what the ignorant person might think. In other words, when we speak of certain things being intrinsically good, the concept of them being objective in some sense, already seems to be built into the concept of intrinsic good or intrinsic value. So if you heard the author, or if you read the author speaking of things being intrinsically good for you if you want them, that phrase may have confused you a little bit. Because if nothing is good in and of itself, it seems to me strange to call them intrinsic goods. It seems more reasonable for me to call them subjective goods. Good for the individual who judges them good, but not good in and of themselves. I hope that clarification helps out a little bit. Now, you probably noted from the get-go that the author of our text account is at odds with the desire satisfaction theory from the get-go. This is in part because we have already had conversations about potential cases of certain things being objectively good for bringing about a good life. And you might recall that one of the examples that I talked about, that the author talked about, was the example of good health as something that is perhaps necessary for living a good life. Now, to speak like a desire satisfaction theorist, the desire satisfaction theorist would say health is not good in and of itself. It is only good if what? It is only good for you if you want it. It is only good for you if you want it. Now, before I talk about some of the initial arguments that might be given in favor of the desire satisfaction theory, I would like to talk about something that will show up a little later in my notes, but I want to mention it now, just so you understand what the argument looks like. According to the desire satisfaction theory, if it's something that you desire and you get it, it is what? It is beneficial for you. And by the way, and I think Mr. Dukes put it nicely, the author of the text equates being beneficial with you with being good for you, with making you happy. So keep in mind, beneficial, good for you, and making you happy are all equivalences when we talk about this. So yeah, you could have used this as G, good for you. But yeah, if you desire it, then it is beneficial for you. Now, the desire satisfaction theory also makes this other claim. If it's something that is beneficial for you, then it's also something that you desire. Now, according to the desire satisfaction theory, good health is only beneficial for you if you, in fact, want it. Now, that might be something that sounds rather strange to you, but do keep in mind there are some people who actually do not desire good health. Yeah, there are some people who do not desire good health. There are some people who actually enjoy self-destructive behavior. And if they do not, if they ever change their mind, it's usually because of what? Yeah, the bad consequences. You've seen the commercials, right? The lung cancer commercials. I hope that wasn't offensive to anyone. It wasn't intended to be. But right now, there's a ton of those public service announcements out there. Lung cancer, things of that nature, throat cancer, and so forth. Well, if I enjoy cigarettes, then it benefits me to toke up. I mean, that's kind of the argument here. Now, the author of the text would say, that's rather silly. Because if you knew it was going to mess you up that way and truly understood the gravity of it, you wouldn't desire it. Because you would understand that it really doesn't what? Yeah, it really doesn't benefit you. Now, I kind of cheated ahead a tiny little bit. From a logical standpoint, you can kind of tell the approach that the author of our text would use for trying to undermine the desire satisfaction theory of happiness. All you got to do is find an instance where if it's beneficial to you, then you desire it. Well, guess what? There's something, but I don't desire it. Therefore, it must not be beneficial to me. Well, guess what? All the author would have to do is point out that there are some things that are desirable, but not necessarily beneficial, and vice versa. In other words, he would use the modus tollens structure to show flaws in the argument. See, logic has not gone away. It comes in handy. Now, before we come back to this in a little more detail, the author talks about some of the preliminary arguments that might be made in favor of the desire satisfaction theory. The first set of arguments, and I won't go through the deductive structures here, are arguments concerning motivation. Now, he contends that the desire satisfaction theorists would say, if something is good for us, we really ought to want it. Because if we want that thing, what will we do? Yeah, it will give us a reason to pursue it. And if you don't want something, the odds are you're not going to want to pursue it, ergo you're not going to pursue it. The motivation argument seems to suggest a sort of strength to the argument. Yeah. If it's good for you, you're going to want it. And if you want it, you're going to want to go and get it. Now, the other argument that the author talks about, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. These are arguments from self-interest. And I'm going to make a little more of this now than the author does. We will be discussing at several times in the course a proposition about human nature that many philosophers have taken seriously, and many regular Joe Sixpacks take seriously too. The proposition that humans might be this. There is a position we will see in a later chapter discussing what is called psychological egoism. Put that in your database. It will come up again and again. Psychological egoism is not an ethical theory. It is a theory of human motivation. It contends that human beings are by nature self-interested. Thus, whatever we do, we are doing it with the belief that it is, in some sense, in our self-interest, no matter what we do. So why do we go to school? We go to school to get a job. Why do we want to get a job? Because we want to pay the bills. Why do we want to pay the bills? Because we like hot and cold running water and cell phones and so forth. In other words, all of the things that we are doing right now, if we're thinking about it, are somehow being done in our self-interest, be it short-term self-interest, be it long-term self-interest. Now, according to supporters of the desire satisfaction theory, the fact that the desire satisfaction theory of happiness is consistent with what some people think to be human nature would be an argument in its favor. Because it admits that we've got desires that we'd like to have fulfilled. And it connects these desires that we'd like to have fulfilled with this idea of happiness, that these things will be what make us happy. Now, let me turn a page. Folks, this is really just a reiteration of some of the things that I have already talked about. This is that formula for the desire satisfaction theory. Stated symbolically, if it's good for us, then we desire it. Remember, good means beneficial, good means conducive to happiness. And if we desire it, it is good for us. Now, I'm stepping a little beyond the textbook here. If you take these two propositions together, G therefore D, and D therefore G, we actually have another relationship here that the author alludes to, but does not spell out. G therefore D, and by the way, this dot right here is the symbol that logicians use for and D therefore G, that right there. This is actually a relationship that we call it is called the biconditional relationship. Folks, the biconditional relationship really isn't that fancy of a concept. It really means the same thing as this. It means what we call logical equivalence. Now, what we mean by logical equivalence is this. And I'll write the way that it's sometimes written symbolically. And by the way, stated in plain English, that says G if and only if D. G if and only if D. What this is saying is this. Every time that G is true, guess what D will be? True. Anytime that G is false, guess what D will be? False. That's what logical equivalence means. When one is true, the other will be true. When the other is false, the other will be false. Now take a guess what circumstance could undermine this view. Finding an example that would show a case where something is good for us, but we want, but we don't desire it. Or finding a case where something is something that we desire, but is not good for us. By the way, this is just a step further than what I showed you before. What I showed you before was using the modus-tollens relationship in order to undermine the conditional. I'm just showing you how you could use, to use a state of affairs example to try to undermine the biconditional. So the idea is if you can find a case where you desire something but it's not truly good for you, that it would undermine the desire satisfaction theory. Or if there's a case where something is good for one, but they don't desire it, that would undermine the desire satisfaction theory. According to whom? According to the author. Keep in mind, the person who supports the desire satisfaction theory would do what? Would provide an argument to try to explain away the alleged contradiction, or what I talked about earlier in the course. Find a way to modify your theory enough to show that the problem isn't really a problem, or to show that the contradiction really isn't a contradiction. Now, we are almost out of time, folks. So what we're going to do in the next portion of the desire satisfaction theory lecture is we will talk about the author's laundry list of various examples that would seem to undermine the desire satisfaction theory. While we're talking about those, I will call upon the arguments of a desire satisfaction theory supporter to try to show you how he, and by the way, he refers to the Heathwood reading. Heathwood actually would have answers, admittedly answers to these criticisms that the author wouldn't necessarily like. You may not like them either. If indeed the author's arguments against the desire satisfaction theory were foolproof, we wouldn't be having this philosophical conversation. In other words, the theory is very difficult to quote-unquote disprove. Heathwood will have responses. We will continue with this next time.